Imagine waiting all day for a single phone call, a knock on the door, or even just a text message, just to be remembered. This is the story of Nora, a woman who spent her whole life caring for her children, only to face her birthday in silence. A birthday that her own children have forgotten. But when the unexpected happens, they are reminded of the one thing they should never have taken for granted. Stick with us as we unravel a heart-wrenching story of love, loss, and regrets. And before we dive in, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us create more stories just like this. The morning sun crept in through the curtains of Nora's small, cozy house. The beams fell on the floral wallpaper, casting soft shadows that danced across the old wooden floors. It was her birthday, the 78th to be exact, but the house was silent, save for the ticking of an antique clock hanging on the wall. Nora sat in her worn, cushioned armchair by the window, her favorite spot in the house. From there, she had a clear view of her quiet suburban street. The autumn leaves had begun to fall, painting the sidewalk with shades of orange, gold, and brown. She sipped her tea slowly, holding the warm cup with both hands, letting the heat comfort her in a way that the silence could not. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Birthdays used to be filled with joy, laughter, cards, balloons, and voices that filled the house. Her 3 children, Kevin, Claire, and Lucas, had once brought life to this home. She could still picture it, as vividly as if it had happened yesterday. Claire, with her bright blonde pigtails, running through the kitchen, Kevin trying to keep up as the eldest, and Lucas, her baby boy, clutching at her apron, giggling as she pretended to chase him. But that was a long time ago. Now, her children were scattered across the country, too busy with their own lives, their own families. They had their own homes now, their own responsibilities. Nora understood that, or at least she told herself she did. Her fingers absent-mindedly reached for her cell phone on the small side table next to her. She had placed it there last night, fully charged and ready. It was still early, she thought. They'll call. Kevin must be on his way to work, Claire probably dropping off the kids at school, and Lucas. Well, she didn't know what Lucas was doing, but surely one of them would remember. They always did, eventually. The minutes ticked by, turning into hours. Nora's tea grew cold, but she still held the cup close to her chest, more for comfort now than for warmth. Outside, the street was quiet, save for a few cars that passed by intermittently. The mailman came and went, leaving only bills and a few catalogs in the box. By noon, Nora's optimism had begun to wane. She stood up slowly, her knees creaking in protest, and shuffled toward the small kitchen at the back of the house. The linoleum floors felt cool beneath her slippers as she moved. She opened the refrigerator and glanced inside. A small cake sat on the top shelf, carefully wrapped in plastic. She had baked it the night before, just in case. A simple chocolate cake with vanilla frosting, her children's favorite from when they were young. Nora smiled sadly as she remembered their eager faces, waiting for a slice. Kevin had always been the first to reach for the biggest piece, while Claire and Lucas would argue about who got the second slice. Those were the moments she held on to, the memories that made the silence now so deafening. She set the cake on the kitchen table but didn't bother unwrapping it. No point, she thought, not yet. Maybe later. The phone remained quiet. Not a single call, not even a message. The silence was heavy, pressing down on her chest like a weight she couldn't lift. She sat at the table, staring at the cake for a long time, her hands folded in front of her. Time seemed to move slower here, each second stretching out endlessly. The ticking of the clock in the living room was the only sound that filled the space, an almost mocking reminder of how much time had passed. She glanced at the clock, watching as the hands slowly moved toward 3 p.m. The hope she had clung to all morning was fading. Nora stood again, this time walking toward the small hallway that led to her bedroom. Her footsteps echoed softly as she passed by the family photos hanging on the walls. There were pictures of her children at every stage of their lives: birthdays, graduations, weddings. Each photo was a reminder of the family she had once been surrounded by, the love and laughter that had once filled this home. As she reached her bedroom, she paused by the dresser. Sitting on top of it was a small, framed photograph of her late husband, Robert. He had passed away nearly a decade ago, but she still talked to him every day, as if he were still there beside her. "I miss you," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "You always made birthdays special." She sat on the edge of her bed, the mattress sinking slightly beneath her weight. Her hands shook as she reached for the old leather-bound journal she kept in the nightstand drawer. Writing had always been her way of processing her emotions, and today, she needed it more than ever. As she opened the journal, she flipped through the pages, her handwriting becoming smaller and more delicate with each passing year. She found an empty page and began to write. "Dear Robert, today is my birthday, but you already know that. You always remembered, no matter how busy life got. I'm not sure if the kids will call today. I know they're busy. I know they have their own lives. But it's hard not to feel forgotten sometimes. I baked a cake, just like I used to when they were little. It's chocolate with vanilla frosting. I wish you were here to share it with me. I wish things were different." She paused, tears welling up in her eyes, blurring the words on the page. For a moment, she let herself cry, quietly and alone. The tears fell onto the paper, smudging the ink, but she didn't bother wiping them away. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting a soft, golden glow over the neighborhood. Nora closed the journal and placed it back in the drawer. She stood and walked back to the kitchen, where the cake still sat untouched on the table. The candles remained in their box on the counter, unused. Maybe tomorrow, she thought. Maybe tomorrow they'll call. The hours continued to pass with agonizing slowness. Nora sat at her kitchen table, her eyes drifting from the clock on the wall to the cell phone lying motionless beside her. The sun had fully set now, casting a dark shadow across the room. The street outside was still quiet, except for the occasional hum of a passing car or the sound of a dog barking in the distance. Even the neighborhood seemed to be forgetting the day. She had prepared herself for this, or at least she thought she had. The last few years, the calls had been less frequent, and visits had become almost non-existent. Birthdays had turned into hurried phone conversations, always cut short by something more urgent on the other end. Work meetings, soccer practices, traffic. Still, this year felt different. There had been no call, no card, no acknowledgement at all. Nora reached for her phone again, this time staring at the blank screen for a few moments before pressing the home button. The light illuminated her face, but there were no notifications, no missed calls. Just the wallpaper photo of her 3 children, taken many years ago during a family vacation. They were all smiling, arms wrapped around each other, sunburned and happy. It was one of her favorite memories, a time when life felt full and complete. She hesitated for a moment, then opened her messaging app. Her fingers hovered over Claire's name first. Claire, her only daughter, the one who had always been so close to her heart. Nora had thought that their bond was unbreakable, that even with the busy life Claire now led as a mother of 2, she would never forget. She typed a brief message. "Hi sweetie, hope everything is okay. Just wanted to say I'm thinking of you. Love, Mom." She stared at the words for a long moment, her heart heavy with uncertainty. Should she send it? Would it make a difference? She thought about adding "It's my birthday today," but decided against it. She didn't want to sound like she was begging for attention, for something that should have come naturally. With a deep sigh, she deleted the message and closed the app. It wasn't her place to remind them of what they should already know. Nora stood up from the table and began to clean up the kitchen. She moved slowly, deliberately, wiping down the counters and washing the few dishes that had accumulated throughout the day. The cake remained on the table, still untouched, still wrapped in plastic. She had thought about cutting a slice for herself earlier, but it didn't seem right. Cake wasn't meant to be eaten alone. Birthdays weren't meant to be spent in silence. As she washed the last plate, her mind wandered back to when her children were young. Birthdays had been such a joyous occasion then, full of noise and excitement. Kevin had always been the most enthusiastic, waking up early and rushing into the kitchen to wish her a happy birthday with a homemade card and a big sloppy kiss on the cheek. Claire would follow soon after, carefully carrying a small gift she had picked out herself, usually a piece of jewelry or a pretty scarf. Lucas, the youngest, had been her shadow, clinging to her side, too shy to say much but always with a bright smile on his face. Those were the days when her house had been filled with life, when her role as their mother had been the center of everything. She dried her hands and walked slowly back into the living room, her footsteps soft against the hardwood floor. The familiar ticking of the old clock followed her as she sat back down in her armchair by the window. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, casting a soft glow over the rows of houses. It was a peaceful neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone knew each other but kept to themselves. Her neighbors were mostly young families or retired couples, but she had always been more reserved, keeping her distance. The quiet of the house began to feel overwhelming, like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. She couldn't help but wonder where her children were now. Kevin lived the farthest away in California. He had a high-powered job in finance, always traveling for work, always busy. The last time they had spoken, he had mentioned a big project he was working on. Nora had been proud of his success, but part of her wished he would slow down, make time for things that really mattered. Claire lived in Boston, not too far from where Nora was, but still, she rarely visited. Nora understood that Claire had her own family to care for, but it didn't stop the ache of feeling forgotten. Lucas, her youngest, had always been the closest to her, emotionally at least. He had moved to New York after college to pursue a career in music, and for a while he had called her every week. But as the years passed, even Lucas had started calling less and less. Nora sighed deeply and leaned back in her chair. She knew she wasn't the only mother in the world to feel this way, to feel as though she had given everything only to be left behind. It was the natural course of life, she supposed. Children grow up, they move on, they build their own lives. But that didn't make it any easier to accept. Her gaze fell to the small side table beside her. Resting there was an envelope, worn and yellowed with age. It was from her late husband, Robert. He had given it to her on their last anniversary before he passed away, a note of love and reassurance that she had read countless times over the years. She reached for it now, feeling the familiar paper between her fingers, but she didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she placed it back down gently, as if to say, "Not today, Robert. Not today." As the night wore on, the quiet became unbearable. She switched on the television, hoping for some distraction, but the noise felt hollow and distant. She flipped through the channels without really seeing any of it. Time passed, the minutes blending into hours, and still there was no call. Finally, at nearly 10 p.m., the phone buzzed. Nora's heart skipped a beat as she snatched it up from the table, her breath catching in her throat. But when she looked at the screen, her heart sank. It was just an automated notification, a reminder to update one of her apps. She set the phone down with a shaking hand, tears welling up in her eyes. The disappointment was crushing, almost unbearable. She had told herself all day that it didn't matter, that she didn't need the validation, that she could celebrate on her own. But the truth was, she had wanted nothing more than to hear her children's voices, to feel, if only for a moment, that she still mattered to them. While Nora sat in silence, her children were hundreds of miles away, tangled in the busy webs of their own lives. Kevin sat in his sleek office in downtown San Francisco, the lights of the city twinkling through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. His desk was cluttered with financial reports and spreadsheets, his phone buzzing incessantly with notifications from clients and colleagues. He ran a hand through his short, graying hair, his brow furrowed in concentration as he typed away on his laptop. At 45, Kevin was a successful financial executive, climbing the ranks of his firm with relentless determination. His job demanded long hours and constant travel. In the past month alone, he had been to 3 cities for meetings, each one more important than the last. His calendar was filled with business dinners, presentations, and conference calls that left him with little time for anything else. That afternoon, as he glanced at his phone during a short break, he noticed a notification that made him pause. It was a reminder he had set a week earlier. Mom's birthday today. He stared at the screen for a moment, a pang of guilt gnawing at his chest. Damn, he muttered to himself. He had completely forgotten. Between the back-to-back meetings and the looming deadline for a big project, he had let the day slip away from him. He considered calling her, but it was already late on the East Coast. His mother was probably asleep by now. "I'll call tomorrow," he thought, making a mental note. "She'll understand." Kevin had always been the responsible one, the eldest, the one who took care of things. Growing up, he had been his mother's right hand, helping with the younger kids when his father was working late or out of town. But as he got older, his focus had shifted. First to college, then to his career, and eventually to his own family. His wife, Sarah, and their 2 teenage boys kept him busy when he wasn't working, and finding time for anything else was a challenge. He felt the weight of his responsibilities constantly, as if there was never enough time to balance everything. His mother's calls had become less frequent, and when they did speak, it was always short, rushed. He hated the feeling, but he pushed it aside, telling himself there would be time later to make up for it. But time had a way of slipping through his fingers, and tonight was no different. Kevin glanced at the clock, sighed, and turned back to his computer. Tomorrow, he promised himself. Tomorrow I'll call. Claire stood in the middle of her kitchen in Boston, surrounded by the chaos of dinner prep. The sound of pots and pans clanging together echoed through the room as her 2 children, Lily and Max, bickered in the background. It was a typical weekday evening. Lily needed help with her homework, Max was asking for more screen time, and the timer for the oven kept beeping, reminding her that dinner was almost ready. At 42, Claire was a successful lawyer, working for a non-profit organization that fought for women's rights. Her work was important to her, something she was deeply passionate about. But balancing her career with motherhood wasn't easy. Every day felt like a juggling act, and some days, the balls slipped from her grasp. As she moved between helping Lily with a math problem and stirring a pot of pasta on the stove, her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it briefly, her mind too focused on the tasks at hand to pay much attention. But then something caught her eye. A text message from her husband, Ryan. "Don't forget it's your mom's birthday today." Claire froze for a moment, her heart sinking. How could she have forgotten? She had been meaning to call her mother all day. But between work meetings, school drop-offs, and dinner preparations, it had completely slipped her mind. "Ugh," she muttered, feeling a wave of guilt wash over her. She had always been close to her mother, but ever since she had her own family, things had changed. It wasn't intentional, but the demands of her children, her job, and her marriage often took priority. She told herself that her mother would understand. She had been a mother too, after all. Still, it didn't stop the guilt from gnawing at her as she wiped her hands on a dish towel and picked up the phone. Claire stared at the screen, debating whether to call now or wait until later, after the kids were in bed. It was already past 9 p.m. on the East Coast. Her mother would probably be asleep. "I'll call her tomorrow morning," Claire thought. "I'll explain. I'll make it up to her." But deep down, she knew that this wasn't the first time she had put her mother on the back burner. And it probably wouldn't be the last. Life was just busy. Too busy. Lucas, the youngest of the 3, sat in a dimly lit bar in Brooklyn, New York, nursing a beer as he stared absent-mindedly at his phone. He was 36, still unmarried, and pursuing his dream of being a musician. For years, he had struggled to make it in the music industry, playing gigs in small clubs, recording demos, and hustling for any opportunity that came his way. Tonight was no different. He had just finished playing a set at a local dive bar, a handful of friends and regulars clapping half-heartedly as he performed. It wasn't the glamorous life he had imagined when he moved to New York, but it was his passion, and he wasn't ready to give it up just yet. As he sat at the bar scrolling through social media, he saw a post from his sister, Claire, pictures of her kids and a busy day at work. Then, as he scrolled further, a thought struck him like a cold wave. Mom's birthday. He had completely forgotten. "Shit," Lucas whispered under his breath. He felt an immediate pang of guilt. Unlike Kevin and Claire, Lucas had always been the closest to their mother. He had been the baby of the family, the one who needed her the most. Even after he moved to New York, he had tried to call her every week, but lately those calls had become less frequent. Lucas finished his drink, staring at his phone. It was late, too late to call. He knew his mother went to bed early, and the last thing he wanted was to wake her. But tomorrow he would make it right. He'd call her first thing in the morning, tell her how much he missed her. Maybe he'd even go visit her soon. He hadn't been home in over a year. She'd love that. But for now, the guilt weighed on him. He stood up, tossed some cash on the bar, and left, his mind already wandering to tomorrow. As the night wore on, the three siblings continued with their lives, each telling themselves they would make it right tomorrow. But tomorrow had a way of slipping away, just like today had. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the thin curtains of Nora's bedroom, casting a pale golden glow over the room. She had woken early, her body accustomed to the routine of rising before the sun. Despite the restless night, she had found a strange peace in the quiet of dawn, but there was still an ache in her chest that refused to fade. The absence of her children the day before weighed heavily on her, even though she tried to push the sadness aside. As she moved slowly through her morning routine, brushing her silver hair, slipping into a soft cardigan, her mind wandered back to the previous night. She had waited, hoping for a call that never came. And yet, she reminded herself, today was a new day. Maybe they had been busy. Maybe today would bring the calls she had longed for. After preparing a light breakfast, Nora stood in the middle of her small kitchen, feeling the weight of the silence around her. The house was still, as it always was. She glanced at the cake, now sitting on the counter, uncovered and untouched. A sigh escaped her lips as she looked away. There was no reason to eat it now. Trying to distract herself from the lingering disappointment, Nora decided to spend the morning tidying up. It was something she had always done when her mind felt too cluttered. Cleaning helped her feel in control, even when everything else seemed to slip through her fingers. She made her way to her bedroom closet, which had become cluttered over the years with old boxes, knickknacks, and memories. As she pulled down a stack of boxes from the top shelf, one of them slipped from her grasp and landed with a soft thud on the floor. The lid popped open, and as Nora bent down to gather its contents, her hand froze. There, tucked beneath a stack of old birthday cards and photos, was a yellowed envelope, slightly crumpled with age. She recognized it immediately. It was a letter she had written years ago but had never sent. A letter meant for her children. With trembling hands, Nora picked up the envelope and sank down onto the edge of her bed. The handwriting on the front, her own, was neat and careful. For my children. She had written it after Robert, her husband, had passed away. It was a time when she had felt particularly lonely, when the absence of her children had begun to feel like a growing chasm in her life. She had poured her heart into that letter, intending to send it to Kevin, Claire, and Lucas, but for some reason she had never gone through with it. Nora carefully opened the envelope, unfolding the paper inside. Her eyes moved slowly over the words, the ink slightly faded but still legible. Her heart ached as she began to read. My dear Kevin, Claire, and Lucas, I've been thinking a lot lately about the passing of time, about how quickly life seems to slip away from us. Feels like just yesterday that I was holding each of you in my arms, watching you grow, teaching you, loving you. But now you've all grown and you've made lives of your own, and I couldn't be prouder. Still, I find myself missing you more than I know how to say. The house feels so quiet without your voices, without the laughter and the noise that once filled every corner of these rooms. I don't expect you to come home all the time or even to call every day, but sometimes, I wonder if you've forgotten how much you mean to me. I know you're busy. I know life pulls you in 1,000 different directions. But please don't forget that I'm still here, waiting for the moments we can share. I don't need grand gestures or constant attention. Just a reminder every now and then that you still think of me, that I'm still a part of your lives. Nora's eyes blurred with tears as she continued to read. Her own words echoing the loneliness she felt even now, all these years later. I love you all so much, more than words could ever express. You've given me a life full of joy, and for that, I am forever grateful. But sometimes I wish I could go back to when you were little, to hold you close again just for a little while. Please remember, no matter how far apart we are, that I am always with you, thinking of you, loving you. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had written. The pain of her children's absence seemed sharper now, knowing that she had felt this way for so long, and yet nothing had changed. Nora sat there for a long time, the letter resting in her lap, her mind drifting between the past and the present. She had raised her children with love, given them everything she could, and now they were out in the world, too far away to notice the ache in her heart. She wondered if they would ever truly understand how much she missed them, how much their absence affected her. But as the minutes ticked by, Nora realized something. The letter was a reflection of her own emotions, a plea she had never voiced aloud. Perhaps it was time to change that. Perhaps it was time to reach out, not in quiet sadness, but in open honesty. She stood, tucking the letter into the pocket of her cardigan. Today she decided she would call them. She would tell them what she had been holding onto for so long, not to make them feel guilty, but to remind them that family was more important than the distance between them. Nora walked slowly back to the living room, her heart heavy but determined. She sat down in her armchair by the window, the phone resting in her lap. With a deep breath, she scrolled through her contacts, her finger hovering over Kevin's name. She hesitated, a flicker of doubt passing through her mind. Would they even answer? Would they understand? The thought of hearing their voices brought both hope and fear, but before she could make a decision, the phone buzzed in her hand. It was a call. For a brief, fleeting moment, Nora's heart leapt. Maybe they hadn't forgotten after all. Maybe one of her children had remembered, finally, and was calling to wish her a happy belated birthday. But as she looked at the screen, her heart sank. It wasn't Kevin or Claire or Lucas. It was her doctor's office, reminding her of an appointment she had scheduled for next week. Nora's hand dropped to her side, the weight of the moment crashing down on her all at once. She set the phone aside, the energy draining from her. She wasn't sure if she would call them after all. Maybe the letter was enough, a reminder to herself that she had always been there for them, even if they weren't always there for her. She sat quietly, staring out the window as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. The autumn leaves fluttered in the breeze, casting soft shadows on the street below. Maybe tomorrow, she thought. Maybe tomorrow they'll remember. Nora's world was shrinking. The days stretched on, long and silent, blending into each other as she went about her quiet routine. There were no phone calls, no unexpected visitors, no voices to break the stillness of her home. The hope she had carried in her heart, the hope that Kevin, Claire, or Lucas would call her even a day late, had faded. She tried to push away the disappointment, but it clung to her like a shadow, following her through every corner of the house. It was early afternoon when Nora decided to step outside. The weather had turned crisp, with autumn in full swing. The leaves on the trees lining her street had deepened into shades of red, gold, and burnt orange. She wrapped a thick shawl around her shoulders and opened the front door. The cool air brushed against her face, refreshing, but also reminding her of the slow march of time. She wasn't as strong as she used to be. Each season felt a little harder to face. As she stepped down from the porch, Nora felt a slight twinge in her knee, a reminder of her age, but she ignored it. The small garden in front of the house had been neglected for weeks now, and she felt a sudden urge to tend to it, to feel the earth in her hands again. Gardening had always been one of her favorite pastimes. Robert used to help her with the heavy lifting, and when the kids were young they would run around, picking flowers or playing in the dirt. Now, the flower beds were overgrown, the soil dry and neglected. She knelt down carefully, pulling on her gloves as she began to clear away the dead leaves and weeds that had overtaken her once prized flower beds. For a while, she lost herself in the task, her hands moving steadily, finding some comfort in the familiar work. The rhythmic tug of pulling out weeds, the scent of the earth, it all brought her a small sense of peace. But then, without warning, she felt a sharp, sudden pain shoot through her lower back. Nora gasped, her hand instinctively reaching for her side. The pain was intense, immobilizing, spreading quickly from her back down through her legs. She tried to push herself up from the ground, but her body wouldn't cooperate. Panic began to well up inside her. She was alone, there was no one to help. Nora collapsed onto the cool ground, the autumn leaves crunching beneath her. She lay there for a moment, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Her vision blurred as she struggled to move to call out, but the only sound that came from her lips was a faint whimper. The pain was unbearable now, and all she could think about was how far away her children were, how none of them would know she needed them right now. Minutes passed, though to Nora it felt like hours. She lay there, helpless, the cold seeping into her bones. Her mind wandered, flickering between moments of clarity and confusion. She thought of Robert, of the way he used to lift her up effortlessly after she'd been kneeling in the garden for too long. She thought of Kevin, Claire, and Lucas, how they used to run around the yard, carefree and full of energy. She thought of the letter she had found the day before, and how she had never sent it. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps broke through her haze of pain. She heard a voice, soft and distant at first but growing louder. "Mrs. Harris." The voice was filled with concern. "Mrs. Harris, are you all right?" It was Margaret, the young woman who lived across the street. Nora had watched her grow up, watched her get married and have children of her own. Margaret's face appeared above her, eyes wide with worry. "Oh my God, are you hurt?" "Hang on, I'll call an ambulance," Margaret said, fumbling for her phone. Nora tried to speak, but her voice was too weak, the pain too consuming. Everything after that was a blur. The sound of Margaret's frantic voice on the phone, the distant wail of sirens, and then, finally, the paramedics arriving. They lifted Nora gently onto a stretcher, their voices calm but urgent as they assessed her condition. The world around her spun, and before she knew it, she was being loaded into the back of the ambulance, the doors closing with a soft thud behind her. The hospital was cold and sterile, a stark contrast to the warmth of her home. Nora lay in a bed, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed rhythmically. A nurse came and went, checking her vitals, adjusting her but no one had told her much about what was happening. The pain had dulled now, thanks to the medication they had given her, but it lingered at the edges of her awareness, a reminder that her body was no longer as strong as it once was. She stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. She had never been in a hospital for something like this before. Sure, she had her share of health issues, aches and pains, blood pressure checks, the usual things that came with age. But this felt different. This felt like a turning point. As the hours passed, a growing sense of dread settled over her. She knew the hospital had contacted her children. She had given them the numbers when she was admitted. But would they come? Would they drop everything to be by her side? Or would this be like all the other times, when their lives were simply too busy to include her? Meanwhile, across the country, Kevin, Claire, and Lucas received the news. Kevin was in the middle of a meeting when his phone vibrated. He glanced at it, intending to ignore it, but when he saw the hospital's name flash across the screen, his heart stopped. Without a word, he excused himself from the room and listened to the message, his face growing pale. Claire was at home, helping Lily with homework when her phone rang. She answered it without thinking, and the moment she heard the nurse's voice on the other end, her stomach dropped. She knew something was wrong before the woman even finished speaking. Lucas was at a friend's apartment, playing guitar and nursing a beer, when his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, annoyed by the interruption, but the look on his face changed the moment he heard the words, "Your mother is in the hospital." Within hours, all three of them were on their way to her. Kevin booked a last-minute flight from San Francisco, his mind racing with a mix of guilt and fear. Claire packed a bag and made arrangements for her kids to stay with their father while she drove the 4 hours to the hospital. Lucas, still reeling from the shock, jumped into a cab to the train station, wondering how he had let so much time slip by without visiting her. Each of them had the same thought running through their minds. "I should have called. I should have been there." As they made their way toward their mother, the weight of their absence pressed down on them like never before. The days they had missed, the moments they had taken for granted, all of it hit them with crushing clarity. The hospital lights were dim as the evening crept in, casting a soft glow over the sterile white walls. Nora lay still in her bed, her body weak but her mind surprisingly sharp as she listened to the rhythmic hum of machines around her. It was strange, she thought, how quickly life could change. One moment she had been in her garden, and the next she was here, helpless in pain and waiting. But what weighed on her the most wasn't the pain. It was the silence from her children. As the minutes turned into hours, Nora's thoughts drifted. She thought about her husband, Robert, and how he had always been her rock during moments like this. He would have been at her side in an instant, holding her hand, making her laugh even in a hospital room. But Robert was gone, and now she was alone, with only her memories and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, her children would come. The nurse entered the room quietly, offering Nora a gentle smile as she adjusted the four. "Your family's been notified, Mrs. Harris. I'm sure they'll be here soon," she said, her voice full of reassurance. But Nora could only nod, her heart heavy with doubt. Would they really come? Or was she destined to face this moment alone, as she had faced so many others in the years since they had drifted away? Kevin's plane landed with a jolt, waking him from a restless sleep. His mind was still racing from the moment he'd gotten the call. The voice on the other end had been calm, professional, but the words had hit him like a punch to the gut. "Your mother is in the hospital." Serious. He had booked the next flight out of San Francisco without hesitation, his mind swimming with regret. Sitting in the back of a taxi, Kevin stared out the window, watching the city lights blur by as they sped toward the hospital. His phone sat heavy in his lap, notifications buzzing with work emails and texts from his wife, but he ignored them all. Nothing mattered now except getting to his mother. The guilt gnawed at him, sharp and unrelenting. He had been so consumed with his career, so focused on climbing the corporate ladder, that he had forgotten the most important person in his life. How had he let it come to this? Claire's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she sped down the highway, the road stretching endlessly before her. The kids were safely with their father, and now all she could think about was her mother, lying in a hospital bed, waiting. The thought of it twisted her stomach into knots. She had always been the closest to their mother, the one who shared her dreams and worries, the one who promised to never let her feel alone. And yet, here she was, racing against time, knowing full well she had already let too much of it slip away. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her. Messages from work, from friends, but she didn't dare look. Her mind was elsewhere, caught between the memories of her childhood and the realization that she had failed to be there when her mother needed her most. Lucas sat quietly on the train, staring down at his hands. The guitar calluses on his fingers felt rough as he absent-mindedly traced them with his thumb. Music had been his escape for so long, his passion, his dream. But now, the very thing that had once brought him so much joy felt hollow. He had moved to New York to chase his dream, but in doing so, he had left behind the one person who had always believed in him. The train clattered along the tracks, the sound rhythmic and soothing, but Lucas couldn't find peace. His mind was filled with memories of his mother's gentle voice, her unwavering support, her quiet strength. She had always been there for him, even when no one else was. And now, when she needed him, he had been absent. He had let time slip through his fingers, and now he was racing to catch up, praying it wasn't too late. When Kevin arrived at the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic hit him immediately. He rushed to the front desk, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm here for Nora Harris," he said, his voice breathless. The nurse looked up, her expression softening. "She's in room 314. Your sister and brother aren't here yet, but they're on their way," the nurse said. Kevin nodded and quickly made his way to the room. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, the sound eerily loud in the stillness of the hospital. When he reached the door, he paused for a moment, his hand hovering over the handle. He wasn't sure what he would find on the other side. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face the reality of his mother's condition. But he had to. He owed her that much. Taking a deep breath, Kevin pushed open the door. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting long shadows across the walls. And there, lying in the hospital bed, was his mother. She looked small, fragile, her face pale against the stark white of the sheets. Kevin's heart twisted painfully in his chest as he moved to her side. "Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Nora's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice. For a moment, she looked confused, as if she wasn't sure if she was dreaming. But then her gaze focused on him, and a weak smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "Kevin," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "You came." Kevin sank into the chair beside her bed, taking her frail hand in his. "Course I came, Mom. I'm so sorry. I should have been here sooner." Nora smiled gently, her fingers curling weakly around his. "It's all right, Kevin. You're here now. That's all that matters." Claire arrived not long after, her eyes red and swollen from crying during the long drive. She rushed into the room, her breath catching in her throat when she saw her mother lying so still in the bed. Without a word, she moved to the other side of the bed, taking her mother's free hand in hers. I'm here." "I'm so sorry," Claire whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Nora turned her head slowly to look at Claire, her smile soft but filled with love. "My sweet girl. It's okay." Lucas was the last to arrive, slipping quietly into the room just as the nurse was adjusting Nora's fore. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his heart heavy with regret as he looked at his mother lying there, so small and fragile. He had always thought there would be more time to visit, more time to call, more time to make up for the years he had spent chasing his dreams. But now, standing there, he realized just how wrong he had been. He moved to the foot of the bed, his eyes filled with unshed tears. Sorry. I should have come sooner." Nora's eyes met his, and even in her weakened state, her love for him shone through. "You're here now," she said softly, her voice full of warmth. "That's all that matters." For the first time in years, all three of Nora's children were together, standing by her side. The room was filled with the quiet hum of machines, the soft shuffle of nurses outside the door, and the steady rhythm of their mother's breathing. They each held on to her, their hearts heavy with the weight of everything they hadn't said, everything they had taken for granted. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that they were there, together, with the woman who had loved them unconditionally, even when they had been too busy to see it. Nora's breathing slowed as the night wore on. Her body was tired, but her heart was full. She had her children with her, and that was the only gift she had ever truly wanted. She squeezed Kevin's hand gently, then Claire's, and finally, she looked at Lucas, her eyes soft with love. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "For what, Mom?" Kevin asked, his own voice trembling. "For being my greatest joy," she said, a faint smile crossing her lips. And then, with her children by her side, Nora closed her eyes for the last time, her heart full of peace. The room fell into a quiet stillness, the hum of machines the only sound that remained. Later, after the doctors had come and gone, after the nurses had quietly taken care of the necessary things, Kevin, Claire, and Lucas sat together in the hospital room, the weight of their loss heavy in the air. But they weren't alone anymore. They had each other, and in the quiet, they found comfort in knowing that their mother had forgiven them, that she had left this world with the love of her children surrounding her. And though the regret of time lost would never fully leave them, they knew that in her final moments, they had given her the one thing she had wanted all along, their presence.